Trovati oggi puntata specialissima di ROCKSVILLE, il format dedicato alla musica, format che ospita le band emergenti e non della scena e non. Oggi abbiamo un ospite che dire speciale è dir poco, quindi vado subito a ringraziare chi ci ha permesso di avere questo ospite, ovvero Andrea dei Mangis, che collabora attivamente a quella che è la nuova produzione di una band che ha fatto veramente la storia del punk rock internazionale, una band che è un culto, una band che ho scoperto a 14 anni e oggi a 40 sono felicissimo di dare il benvenuto all'interno del format a Mr. Ben Weasel from Screeching Weasel. How's it going, Ben?
Good. How are you?
I'm super good. Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor for me. I'm a fan, so that's hard to ignore. But apart from that, I'm here to present this brand new, beautiful record, the awful disclosure of Screeching Weasel. The very first question, it might sound there's a dog beside me. I'm sorry, but he's
It's all
not
right.
gonna bark. He's not gonna bark. Uh, there's the very first question. It's this one. How much is challenging for you to record a brand new record? I mean, when it comes to like number 14 of your career studio album, I mean, it's challenging. Not only a pleasure, but also challenging.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I don't really think about it too much. And I think that's because I don't think too much about what I've done in the past. And I mean, in terms of, you know, I did these many records and I have to live up to it or, whatever. I mean, I think I'm reasonably confident in my songwriting abilities. And that's really all it comes down to is, you ask yourself, are the songs good? So, you know, after doing so many records, you kind of have to challenge yourself because the only challenge is for me is coming up with the money to make the record and dealing with all the logistics of doing something that is essentially self-released. So the challenge can be, what can I do to not get bored, which means, not repeating myself, sort of looking at what fans like, which, is typically the stuff that you're good at, and keeping in mind that you're making music for an audience, but also trying to keep yourself interested. And that's a balance that you want to strike that can be a little bit challenging, but I've got a good producer and I've got a good bunch of guys in the band, and that helps a lot.
Yes, I was thinking about the balance. Like you said, you'll probably also have to balance the fact that this genre, and especially Screeching Weasel, you have codes, codes that should be followed also for the fans' experience. They love some of the records that are, the highest of your career in their opinion, and so do you feel like sometimes you have to compromise in between your songwriting and what people has to expect from those codes and that legacy?
Well, luckily, no, because we have a pretty dedicated fan base that is pretty that gives us a certain amount of leeway. So, what you're talking about, kind of the conventions of the genre, you're absolutely right. I mean, those are, and they're conventions for sometimes, often good reason. But part of what I try to do is to sometimes subvert those expectations. And we're fortunate enough to have a fan base that will accept that. And so there's a way, I think, to embrace the rules, if you were, if it were, or the codes, as you say, while also in this kind of meta way, subverting that and kind of looking at it from the outside and kind of looking at it tongue in cheek. So there, you can really play around with those things a lot. And I think the reason a lot of bands don't is because it's a subgenre that is on the surface very limiting. So so people tend to stick too closely to the rules. And my attitude was always, yes, you need to know the rules because they're usually there for a good reason. But once you know them and you've kind of honed your craft and become better at what you do and more confident in what you do, then you can start breaking the rules a little bit or making your own rules. And I think that's where we're at now. And like I said, we're fortunate that our fans accept that and appreciate that.
That's a good point of view. I was talking to another Ben just the other day. That was Ben Harper, and we were talking about the fact that he produced a song using the sound of the clavinet, like that instrument that it's very famous for, Superstition from Stevie Wonder. And he said, yeah, that's a reference, that's for sure, but nobody owns the sound. So even in the punk rock genre, probably Screeching Weasel doesn't own the sound of the organ in songs or something like that. Ramones probably doesn't own the sound of punk rock in general. So that's why probably like breaking the rules, it's more flattering.
Well, an instrument is just a tool. So you're right. Nobody owns it, and even if something is really closely identified with a certain band, you can always take that thing, especially if it's an instrument, and use it for your own means and subvert it. But look, music, all music it feeds off other music, and so particularly rock and roll is a genre that is built from kind of copying and stealing and creating a mishmash of different things from different artists. And there's a very long history of that going back to the beginning of the genre. So when people talk about originality in music, they often miss the mark, because what's original is not your chord progression or your instrumentation or any of those things. What's really original is what you bring to all that as an individual. So, and then when you bring your individuality into this established, very seemingly rigid set of rules and instruments and all these things, then there's actually a lot more that you can do with it than there appears to be.
That's great, and I totally agree with this. For this record, the awful disclosures of Screeching Weasel, you came up with 14 songs, but how many songs you wrote and you selected from to cut this 14?
I don't know exactly, but certainly more than double. I mean, certainly probably more than 30. If you're counting everything that was considered, even maybe ideas that hadn't been finished yet, any given record, you're probably talking over the course of, going back and checking out old stuff and writing new stuff, you're talking, probably 40 or 50 usually.
Wow, that's a lot, but I can imagine that maybe you left something in the closet, maybe from previous record, or something that probably wasn't fitting in the right record at the right time.
Sure.
Also lyrically speaking, maybe, right?
Yeah. So, for instance, the song "Kill to Cure" is one that is almost 20 years old, and it's kicked around in various forms with various lyrics. And for one reason or another, it just didn't make a series of records. It didn't make it onto those records. And it was never because it wasn't a good song. It maybe didn't fit on a particular record, or there were times when the producer felt like maybe it needs a new bridge or whatever. So that happens all the time. And that's an extreme case from this new album. But most of the stuff that ended up on the album, more than half of it was written over, probably a 4 or 5 month period, which is not typical for me lately. But I kind of got into a songwriting groove the winter before last and knocked out a lot of those. And then a lot of them were either songs or parts of songs, not a lot of them, but 2 or 3 of them were songs or parts of songs that started in other places. And like I said, maybe didn't make this or that record, but they, weren't fully formed. They weren't where they needed to be. And then I was able to get them where they needed to be for this album. For instance, the song Gates Lift Higher Heads, I had that verse forever, but the chorus I had for it was no good. So for this record, I wrote a new chorus that I really liked, and I wrote a couple of guitar lead sections that I liked as well, and therefore was able to finish it. The song How Art Thou Fallen started out as a song for my old band, the Riverdales, and it was going to be on what was to be a new record when that band split up. And so I never really finished it back then. And so that kind of stuff happens all the time. But quite a lot on the new album was written in a pretty short period of time, pretty recently.
That period of time, winter 2020, is probably the reason why you pick up some different subjects that are we might consider like dark themes, like apocalypse and that and something like that. Is it connected to what you were living at the moment?
Well, you know what? Anybody who does art is influenced by their environment, and often in ways they don't know. So or they don't realize. So everything is culturally somehow connected. So, Mozart wouldn't have written what he wrote the way he wrote it if he had lived 50 years later or 50 years earlier. But having said that, I'm not sure entirely how much you're always aware. So for me, I didn't really give it a lot of thought. On the previous album, I had done some, what you would call some darker stuff. And it was just kind of, interesting to me. And, a lot of what I'm doing thematically will often have to do with films I'm watching or books I'm reading. So that probably had something to do with it as well. For instance, the song In the Castle is a song about, it's my version of the Shirley Jackson novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which I had never read until that winter. And it was really good pandemic reading. And it's funny because I had been meaning to read it for years, but I never knew what it was about. So I often, when I read a book, I won't really I don't really care what it's about. It's just for maybe I like the author or somebody recommended it or whatever. So yeah, there are, and sometimes things just kind of come together in that way where you start noticing it. It seems like things are just dropping into your life like these coincidences, but really I think it's probably you just start noticing certain things or giving more emphasis to certain things that come up into your field of awareness that you didn't before.
You said something you read, something you watched, like maybe movies, but I know that one of your passion is also like writing screenplays.
Yeah.
Isn't it? So did it happen like you translated one of the creative feeling that you had for maybe a screenplay into one or two or maybe an album in entirely?
No, but I mean no, because I actually took one of those and turned it into a novel, which I'm finishing up now with the editing, and so that's kind of separate. But I mean, I really shouldn't say no, because like I said, I think a lot of things kind of seep through subconsciously in a way that you don't always completely understand. And I am really interested in certain, themes, apocalyptic themes, and especially how they relate to things like guilt and sin and redemption. I'm interested in uh, sort of things that sort of break through the membrane, the relatively thin membrane of reality that we impose on the world, and make us stop dead in our tracks. So, a lot of the things that are probably really good devices for drama are also interesting from, a philosophical point of view, and psychological point of view, and even a theological point of view. So all those things are, like, if you start going down one road with those, I'm sure that when you do other creative work that maybe isn't explicitly about that, it's probably, it's like they used to say, the milk in the refrigerator takes on the flavor of whatever's next to it, which it doesn't really, but it's, kind of an old saying, and it's that same kind of thing, I'm sure.
Considering all the point of view that you named, I'm gonna explain this question in the next one. But who do you trust at the moment? After a moment of time that it's been so, we could argue about anything, from everything that happened in the last 2 years. We weren't supposed to trust anyone, the government, or what they were telling us to do or not to do, or whatever. From a theological point of view, who do you actually trust?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I'm not exactly sure how to answer that, because I'm not exactly sure. I'm not exactly sure I do, although I would say that's probably a failing on my part. The rather than a person or an office or something like that, I would say that what I trust in a general sense is art. I think that art at its best can art isn't theology, art isn't psychology, art isn't politics, art isn't philosophy, and it's not meant to be. But at its best, it has these kind of tentacles that reach out and can incorporate all these things into a wordless, even if you're using words, even if you're using poetry or prose, it creates this thing that is actually beyond language in a way, that speaks to the transcendent. So, so for me, at a time when, and I know just what you mean, at a time when you don't really trust the media, the government, even some of the people in the medical profession, even your fellow man sometimes, I think that that art can often cut through a lot of those barriers and show you something about the world and the way the world works that is not it's not dualistic, it's not pedantic, it doesn't insist on itself, it certainly doesn't provide answers, but it can show you something that enables you to say, somehow this makes sense, somehow I will get by.
Probably because of art, you and Andrea from Mangis came together. That's probably how you started this friendship, and probably Andrea is one of the few people that you can trust, because you decide to print the record with Stripe music. That it's Stripe
Oh yeah,
record.
yeah. I
So
mean, that's not. I mean, he's a good guy. I don't have any concerns about him at all from a business point of view. So yeah, for sure. I mean, and that's really important because it's a pretty crummy business, and quite a lot of people are very untrustworthy. So it's nice to be able to work with somebody where you don't have to worry that they're going to steal from you.
And again, it's a matter of balancing sometimes. You name the word business, that it's always, when it comes to punk rock, talking about business, you got, the very close mentality of people that says, well, punk rock shouldn't be about business, but there's business around punk rock, that's for sure. It's sometimes you have to consider your band as an agency, as a company that has to deal with cost of flying, touring, producing records and stuff like that. Within the last years, did your point of view on business in this scene change, or it's been just an evolution of what you thought when you were younger, maybe?
No, I mean, I think, I reached a point, I was very idealistic and naive when I was younger. And I was very sure that other people were doing things that they shouldn't be doing, with their bands and their business and everything. And it was just because I had no idea what the reality was. And so I was fortunate that at a relatively young age, at about 23 years old, I was forced to face that reality and realized that I had a business whether I liked it or not. So for the people who get upset about talk about business and stuff, the problem with that is that the business is there whether you like it or not. There's nothing you can do about it. You're doing business. If you go out and play a gig, even if you don't get paid, even if you say I'll play for free, you're still doing business. So what it really comes down to is, are you going to pretend you're not and therefore do things that are not only bad for you and your creative work and your art, but that have negative repercussions for everyone else. So when somebody goes out, a really good example, I don't know if they ever had this in Italy, but in rock music in America, it's not so much a thing anymore. But for a long time, there was a pay to play scenario where you would go and you would have to sell a certain amount of tickets. You didn't get paid, to get people into the bar to hear you play. And a lot of bands did that. And the more bands did that, the more the people who were pulling this nonsense were emboldened to demand it of other bands. And so it put people into a bad situation. And so now you've got a situation where you have to do business and you don't maybe have the options that you would have had otherwise had you done business intelligently from the first place. And that's that's one example. But the point is, you can and you must be an artist and a businessman. And if you're not a businessman, you must hire somebody to represent you who is. Because if you just want to go off in this world and pretend like it's nothing but art, the business is coming after you whether you like it or not. You have to deal with it, even if you really don't want to. So it's best, I think, to deal with it intelligently and to deal with it ethically, and to have a strong set of guiding principles when you go in with your eyes wide open. And then you're less apt to have these wild swings between kind of like living like a monk or selling out, whatever that means, trying to become a millionaire and maybe making some decisions you shouldn't. And I'm not even advocating against either of those extremes. People should do what they want. But I know for me, I'm right where I want to be. I'm real happy where I'm at. And so the balance between business and art is just where I like it. I would always like to be able to do more creative work and less business work, but I can't. So, but having said that, I don't feel any tension in terms of anything except the way that business maybe imposes on my time a little bit sometimes.
Let's get back into the record, because into the record, it's your son playing a piano and organ, Joe.
Yes.
And is it the first time he's actually inside one of your records?
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, he and his sisters also sang on the bridge on one of the songs on in La Quinta del Sordo. Actually, they didn't sing, they screamed and yelled, which was pretty funny. But yeah, it's the first time any of my kids have been on a record. So, and it was really a case of he's a better keyboardist than I am, and so he can sit down, he sight reads really well, and he can sit down and play Bach and Beethoven, Mozart, Chopin, all that stuff really well, and it's much harder for me. I can kind of pick my way through the easiest stuff, but he is a very fluid player, and so it was fun. It was fun, and we did it right here in my office, and I let him work with the producer. I went in the other room because I didn't want to put pressure on him.
But considering like Joe being in the record for the very first time, I was asking myself which values you would like to share with your son and with your daughters that you maybe discovered through all these years in, in all of that. I should say in the business, in the scene, in bands and stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's all of a piece, that parenting and the way I do my business and all that. But I have tried really hard from the time they were at a young age to impress on them the importance of art, and also I have tried very hard to demystify it and to make sure that they are not in this kind of starstruck point of view when it comes to people, famous people. Like all kids, they've got their famous pop stars and whatnot that they follow. But our former guitarist works for Billie Eilish now, and so my daughters were able to go to one of those shows and meet her backstage, which was. But I made sure to talk to them about it and say, this is somebody who's at work. So if you meet her, be respectful of her time and all that. And also, that just, this is, you're a fan of this woman, but she's just a person, she's a very talented person, but just a person. So don't put people up on a pedestal. It's not realistic, and it's not fair to them. And, enjoy what the artist does. Don't worry so much about if you like The Ring, you don't have to look back and say, well, Wagner said some really horrible things about Jews, so I don't know if I can like him. He did, and maybe you wouldn't like him personally, but I don't see what that has to do with his work. And I think it's very important that we understand that truly great art transcends even its maker. If it didn't go beyond its maker, it wouldn't be very good.
I agree with that. Very last question about the record. It's been presented as a trip into the deepest fears, but with pushing hooks. Is it a correct description of this record?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, it's I think there is a sense of hopelessness on it, which is deliberate. That is not a message. That's not me saying to people, you should be hopeless. It's just acknowledging that is a fact of life. And probably, in reference to your earlier question or comment about the pandemic times and everything, it probably had something to do with that idea of everybody's world was turned upside down, and it's very easy to become hopeless, and it's very easy to ask why, and it's very hard to not get an answer why. So, you know, when you're talking about this kind of who do you trust, I mean, you know, I'm of the belief that that a really solid, robust religious faith will always have some doubts. You know, doubt is always a part of that. And the great example of that is the book of Job in the Old Testament. And one of the reasons why that is a great piece of art, you know, even if you were to largely strip it of its theology and just look at it in a mythological sense, you would have to acknowledge it's a great piece of poetry, not only because it's well written, but because in the end, it doesn't provide an answer. You know, at the end of this book, we're not really reassured. God appears finally at the end of the book and questions Job. You know, the most of the book is kind of a questioning of God and a defense of God by Job's friends. And God at the end won't be questioned, and he instead questions Job. And it's very mysterious. There's no clear answer. And I think that we can look at a lot of what transpired in our culture, especially in Western culture, in those kind of terms. I don't think we've come up with an answer. I think that in a way, a kind of chasm opened up, and our extreme political responses to that are just really an attempt to grasp and control something that can't be grasped and controlled. We saw something almost like something out of one of those H.P. Lovecraft stories where this other world opens and these horrible things are there. And so it's an interesting question to me, if that happens in the Lovecraftian sense, in the sense of Job and his sufferings, what is our response to that ultimately? How do we maintain a sense of hope in such hopelessness? So and I think to some extent that must have been what was going through my mind, or going through my soul when I wrote this stuff, because it's very obvious and it's very present there. But I would hate for people to think that that I'm trying to deliver a message. I'm not. I'm trying to ask questions. I'm trying to pose a situation and ask myself, and maybe others can ask themselves, what do you do? I don't know. I don't have any answers, but I want to find a way to hope. And I think humanity at its best, that's what we do. We find a way to keep going. We find a way to hope that usually doesn't even make a whole lot of logical sense, but we just keep going, and we look at the people in our lives, often the most simple people, the people who maybe aren't the best educated, the people who don't have the most money or aren't the most successful, but the people who plug away day in and day out. And it goes against everything that we're supposed to believe about the world and how the world works. But maybe we can learn something from those people.
I'm sorry for the next question that is going to be really back to basic, but it's a question that Italian fans are asking me to ask you. With this brand new record, with the fact that it's stripped records that released the vinyl, are we gonna have more chances to actually see Screeching Weasel, at least in Europe?
It's really hard to say. I mean, right now, we can't get a gig. I mean, not on similar terms to pre-pandemic. The money just isn't there, and it's very expensive to get, you know, all my guys from 5 different states into one place. I mean, even to do a show in the States is quite expensive. So, you know, I can't answer it. I mean, I'll say this. I'll say that we were slowing down before the pandemic hit. We weren't playing as much, and I was happy about that. I was trying to do a little bit less because I don't like the travel. But I honestly, there's no plan here. The plan is if we get a good offer, we're going to seriously consider it and try to do it. But there's nothing hidden here. It's just, I talk to my agent and it's like, yeah, I'm working on it, so your guess is as good as mine. I'm not against the idea, but I can't make any promises.
Okay, but we have the record. It's beautiful. It's solid. It has very good songs in that. It's the full disclosure of Screeching Weasel. It's been for me an honor and a privilege to talk to you, Ben. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you as well.
It's been a pleasure. See you, hope soon, somehow, somewhere.
Okay,
Bye.
thanks. So long.
Bye.